So welcome to this shipping panel, Charting the Best Course to Decarbonisation. My name is Charles Goddard. I'm Editorial Director at the Economist Group. So it wasn't so long ago that the shipping industry was saying that decarbonisation is too difficult. The industry was too important to force change on, and that anyway, solutions were not available immediately. But there has since, I think, been a real shift in attitudes. Member states of the IMO, the governing body for shipping, have committed to 2030 targets to reduce carbon emissions. And in 2023, we hope that we will see the target of net zero by 2050 being agreed upon. We shall talk a little bit about that. It needs to be. And of course, shipping companies, big and small, though not all, and ports too, and many across the shipping supply chain are actively seeking solutions, as well as our investors. But I suppose the question that sits in front of us is, are things really moving at the speed they need to in order to meet the overall global warming targets and the reduction of emission targets? As the saying goes, is winning slowly, which I think is what's happening at the moment in shipping, is winning slowly the same as losing? So I'm joined today by three excellent and distinguished panelists. Jeremy Nixon, Chief Executive of Ocean Network Express, Andreas Nordseth, who is Director General of the Danish Maritime Authority, and Quah Hoon, who's Chief Executive of the Maritime and Port Authority in Singapore. A warm welcome to you all. And you'll find the biographies for the three panelists on the screen under this media player. So let's jump in, shall we? And Jeremy, let me come to you first, and let's talk about container shipping companies first out. And not a few people would say that, in general, the shipping industry is not moving nearly quickly enough. But let's focus on the container shipping sector. Is that sector embracing decarbonisation? My sense is it is. And is it moving quickly enough towards that decarbonisation?
Yes, I fully agree with your opening stance, Charles. I think if we go back to 18 months, 2 years ago, I think there was still many reasons why shipping was going to be slow and was struggling to find a direction to decarbonize due to the, let's be honest, very, very significant, difficult scientific factors in and around such big ships moving across large oceans and unable to just plug into the electricity supply grid. We had to find completely new fuels, completely new technology, new designs to do it. And the question all around it was, well, how are we going to get that done? Who's going to finance it, etc.? I think we've had a huge move forward in the last 12 months. And last week, actually, the World Shipping Council, which represents the top 20 container shipping companies in the world globally, plus some other additional smaller carriers, launched their green strategy paper with 6 very key points setting out a pathway that we want to move forward. And it was a very strong call to action by the industry regulator, which is the UN's IMO, International Maritime Organisation, with a very clear requirement that we want to move quickly. And to do that, we needed 6 key things to happen. And we were ready to make the forward investment. We were ready to move in that direction, but we did need to have a common framework, a universal global framework to do that. And we were ready to lay that out and to encourage the IMO and the 150 governments that make up the IMO to set us and help us get that going to really speed up the decarbonisation journey.
So tell us just briefly what that universal framework that you think should be in place looks like, Jeremy. And of course, one of the great challenges here is that shipping is not just about container shipping. It's about a very wide range of different kinds of shipping. And that bringing in a set of universal standards is a difficult thing to negotiate and complicated to implement.
Yeah, and that's fully acknowledged. There's about 8,000 container ships out there, and there's the ships overall out there. But I think the container shipping industry, is a significant player in terms of global supply chains, and in terms of being also somewhat unique in that container shipping companies are the owner of the asset, they're the charterer of the asset, and they're dealing with the end customer. So we have over 500,000 shippers and consignees out there, which are directly being handled by the container shipping companies. So we're really involved truly with Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions, and dealing with the whole end-to-end stakeholders in that journey. And the real key thing, I think, is that, first of all, we fully recognize that. Yep.
Sorry, no, I mean, just wanted you quickly to touch on that framework that you were talking about earlier, Jeremy.
Yeah, so the 6 key points are, first of all, to push for net zero by 2050. Secondly, to bring in market-based measures, a carbon price that will be applicable globally in a universal fashion. And our preference would be to go to a fuel levy as being the primary way of doing that. To define some key green corridors so we can speed up. A quick identification of the key new fuels and working with the energy companies to promote and develop those new fuels. Coming up with the new technical standards for new ships, which are zero carbon emission standards, and when which date we would introduce those and which date we would then phase out the older tonnage. So those were really the key points. There's a few other ones, but those are really the key issues.
Thank you. Let's come back to many of those, I hope, or some of those at least, in the rest of the discussion. But let me come straight to Andreas Nordseth, if I can, and just perhaps pick up the conversation there, Andreas, in the sense that, of course, we know Denmark to be a leader in many ways in the decarbonisation of shipping. But even by your own admissions, I think, the challenges to putting in place the solutions to the climate crisis, the regulations, and indeed even getting administration around this working is very, very difficult. Do you see eye to eye with Jeremy on some of the areas that are clearly needed if we're going to put in place the kind of principles and approaches that are going to accelerate the decarbonisation of shipping?
Yeah, thank you, Charles. And I would say, yes, very much. I see eye to eye on what Jeremy just sort of outlined. And I also agree that looking at the shipping sector, and in particular looking at the container shipping sector, there's no doubt it has moved really a very, very huge step forward on the agenda of decarbonizing. Absolutely. But I think also that we should be very frank and say that we are nowhere near having not even a 50% commitment looking at the total population or the total community of international shipping. We have, well, depending on how you count it, but we have between 70 to 90,000 international ships trading around globally, and container shipping counts for less than 10,000. We need to have a very much broader commitment from basically all operators, and then that comes down to then what can make that happen. And I would say that that's where regulation comes into play. And again, we would definitely work very hard for having next year stipulating that we have to aim for a net zero. That means zero carbon shipping in 2050, because that's what we need to then stipulate and generate the sort of more detailed requirements, but again, to send a very clear signal and have the whole shipping industry as a whole committing themselves to demand green fuels and green technology. And I think that is what we have. That's the role of regulation that sort of makes the demand and make sure that the whole shipping community, all the operators, all the owners, demand solutions. Because what we really need now is that we need to have much more companies and operators getting into the equation and demand green fuels. There's only one. Governments cannot establish a supply chain of green fuels, in my view. We need to have a market demand that's going to drive that development. And that's why we need to have all the operators in the market. But I think we are on a good track, but we definitely need to keep pressure on it. And then, as you said, Charles, we're probably coming back to the questions of market-based measures, carbon levy or other mechanisms, and there's also a lot of still barriers and obstructions that we need to address in terms of detailed technical regulation. How do we ensure that when new green technology is coming into the market, that it can actually get the certification and we do set the standards. And I just want to say already at this point that we already have experience now in Denmark and in the Danish Maritime Authority that when you get these pilot projects with ships coming in and saying we want to use a completely new kind of fuel, and then we find out that we have no regulation whatsoever to handle that. So that brings us all into a twilight zone where we together have to work together in a way that we have never worked before, together with the builders, the designers, the operators, and trying to find and set new standards and coping with that. And I think that is definitely one of the things that we also have to be very aware that it's fairly easy to stipulate a strategic target in 2050. We're going to be carbon neutral, but there's a lot of practical issues that has to be addressed also in the short run in terms of paving the way for the first movers. But I just want to also express my accreditation and appreciation for, I think that in particular the shipping, the container shipping segment, but also a few other places, but in particular the container shipping segment has definitely characterized themselves now as a very strong first mover, and I think that sort of shows the way, but we need to get many more on board as well.
Well, let me pick up there, if I can, Quah Hoon, with you in Singapore. And Singapore, of course, one of the world's largest ports and shipping container, particularly container, but not just container logistics centers. I mean, Andreas's point that, we're not going to get there quickly, and we're not going to get there at all in some ways without having that framework, that sort of long-term framework of 2050, net zero by 2050 in place. We've been waiting a long time now for the IMO and its members to get to the point where they all agree that can be something that can be done. Is that really essential, do you think, now for moving forward the decarbonisation of shipping quickly? And is Singapore committed to that process to drive the IMO as a member towards that 2050 target?
Thanks, Charles. I just wanted to build on what Andreas and Jeremy said. The momentum of shipping to decarbonize has not only taken it has not taken a step back, but even during the pandemic, actually we have accelerated very fast forward. This is due to various factors, because of new findings on climate change, because of Glasgow COP discussion, and even within IMO itself, there's a lot of discussion on how we can push forward on it. 2030, I think we are comfortable because in terms of the energy efficiency index, the regulation is out, the specifications are out, and companies are all falling in line. The question now is 2050. Well, we can set targets. That's what IMO will be discussing, as what Andreas said, over the next 1 or 2 years. But for me, as a global hub port and a bunkering port, the key is really in 3 areas. First is what is the technological solutions and the breakthrough that we can make over the next few years. And technology breakthrough means that what is the future of ship? Should it be methanol? Do you have some ammonia engines that's able to take place on board the vessel? So technological breakthrough and how to make it more cost effective, because new energy always costs more, and that price differential is actually very important for higher take-up rate among the companies. Second, Andreas mentioned that it really is about standards and regulations. It's a global challenge which we require different ports to come together to set standards and regulations. So in Singapore, what we are trying to do is to set up regulatory sandbox. We already have biofuel who have come in terms of bunkering. LNG not a problem as a transition fuel because we have all the regulatory standards in place. We can do ship-to-ship LNG bunkering. We just received the first LNG bulk carrier in Singapore. Container shipping, we've done quite a number. Last year, we've done 21 ship-to-ship LNG bunkering operations, and we are able to handle 300. Now, the question is ammonia bunkering, methanol bunkering, which requires trials to take place. How do we adapt the standards to allow such bunkering to take place? lastly, is the infrastructure. Land-based infrastructure, I think we've talked about it in various forums. It really is about port putting in place the infrastructure to allow availability of the fuel. And that's where we talk about the value chain ecosystem on the energy side. Well, you can talk about, you want methanol fuel, or you can talk about ammonia ship, but if you don't have availability and if you don't work together with the energy companies to make it available, have value chain bunkering infrastructure, followed by the engine spec standards and regulations, it's not possible that the global challenge can be tackled. So in my view, back to your question, Charles, I think the momentum is there, the commitment and the will is there. It requires private-public partnership. In Singapore, we set up an international advisory panel. It's come up with a slew of recommendations, and one of which is to set up a global center of maritime decarbonization, which ONE is one of the partner. 120 million in within 3 weeks of the recommendations, and it's now set up after 3 months. It's up and running. We are going to develop ammonia bunkering standards. So I think these are the type of initiative we need to set the momentum going, and don't stop there. In fact, go faster.
So thank you. I think that's a really comprehensive answer in many ways. And I just want to come to this big question that you raised right at the middle, which is in a way the elephant in the room. And that is, what fuels and what propulsion systems are we going to use? You're obviously challenged by the question of what infrastructure to put in place, because at the moment we haven't even made a transition. We haven't even made decisions about what kind of fuels there are. And there are all sorts of pricing decisions to make, decisions about safety, about infrastructure, about who invests first. And I think most importantly, decisions about what comes first. Is it the ships or the fuel? And I think that if Jeremy, I can come to you and then come to the others as well. How is this problem of making decisions about fuels and about technologies going to be unraveled? Because, of course, it can't just be one fuel, I think, that ultimately drives ships. But there are going to be some pretty important choices that need to be made, and quickly, if we are going to get the investments done in time to meet the targets.
Oh, very good point, Charles. And I think Lei Hoon summarized it very well. And also Andreas' comments are super. So, yes, I think we ideally will get down to one or two fuels long term. And if we can do that, we can then get that critical economies of scale with the energy producers. And also it'll make, for like Lei Hoon with her fantastic Singapore bunkering setup, it'll make it a lot easier if we can come down to one or two fuel types rather than 4 or 5. But very frankly, at the moment, we're still going through that technological revolution of trying to understand how can we adapt these fuels to a maritime environment. And we've seen some really good progress at the moment, and very strong commitment from Maersk Line, who are committing to building ships that would run on methanol. And a number of us are very seriously studying at the moment designs around hydrogen and ammonia as well. And then we also have certain carriers that are deploying LNG ships today. And as we know, LNG is a carbon gas, but they hold out the view that potentially we could get into green LNG or some sort of hybrid version of LNG, which could have a significantly reduced carbon footprint. So maybe, is it going to be a gas? Is it going to be a liquid? But the key bottom line is, and this really comes back to the energy companies and how we have to work with the energy companies, is that the green molecule is what it's all about. And it's getting enough of that green molecule for container shipping and all shipping of all types, because we cannot just plug into the mains. We can't just go for that electric hybrid car solution. We will need green energy for green hydrogen, or whether we're going to do that through methanol as well. And potentially for this green LNG. So a lot of work is happening in that space at the moment. But those fuels, and we'll come back to this market-based measures, those fuels are going to be 2, 3, 4, 5 times more expensive than the current fuel oil solutions today. So we need to work to get some critical mass going. We need to be able to get the price down of this stuff. We also need to get the bunkering systems in place. And at the same time, we need to have a market-based measure so that we can level up on the competition between the old carb fuels and the new decarb fuels.
So let's come to that market-based measurement discussion in a second. But I just want to, Andreas, if I can come to you just to pick up this conversation, because I mean, as Jeremy was saying, I mean, a Danish company, Maersk, has already sort of put its cards on the table and said, look, we're going to buy 9 ships, I think it is, that could run on methanol, but I think they're dual. They have their engines, their propulsion systems could run on other fuels as well, traditional fuels. What is it that you think that governments can do to accelerate this process of choice? In other words, in some ways, potentially de-risk the choice of what fuels are out there in order to to accelerate this process.
Well, I think I think that first of all, it's important that we facilitate and make sure that when a shipping company, an operator in the market, wants to invest in green technology, that we need to ensure that there's a framework where we say that, okay, if you invest in this, which is probably a 20 years investment, then it will be sustainable. And we will also, and that's Hoon and I and probably a few other of our colleagues are going to set up, I would prefer some kind of international partnership there, so we can ensure that you can operate globally. Because we are still lacking standards, so we need to have it takes years to set standards in IMO and other places. So that's one thing that the government can do, so that if you come up with a solution with a green fuel, that we facilitate that you will be allowed to operate this tonnage, this ship for the next 20 years. I think that's very important. But again, I would say that what we can do as regulators is still to facilitate and set up the demand for action, because again, it is the market that has to drive the development, and also listening to Jeremy, and I think that very much it's the same that my experience is speaking to companies in Denmark and other places, that I don't think that anybody wants to put all their money on one fuel. There's probably going to see several kind of fuels, and I think also if you buy a ship today, you need to have dual fuel and maybe even triple fuel in the future, because you cannot rely on one supply chain for one kind of fuel. And then it comes down to, I agree, right now it's methanol, it's ammonia. I think that there's a lot of challenges associated with ammonia, because ammonia is a very green fuel. It can be, but it's also very poisonous. I mean, if you just use a few drops of ammonia in a bucket of water when you clean your house, I mean, you know what kind of panic you can create in your family. So just imagine if you have thousands of tons in a ship. So there are definitely issues that we have to address, and we should not. I think that has become very clear to me in the past year, that one thing is the sort of energy, political strategy, thinking and decision, but there's a lot of practical issues that we need to address. I mean, methanol have a lower flame point, for instance, than fossil fuel. So all of a sudden we have fire protection issues that we need to address, and that's why it's so important that we work closely together with industry and designers. But I think that we, as governments, we just need to be sort of totally committed to find solutions and pave the way so that industry will not end up with obstacles that all of a sudden makes it impossible to invest or find solutions. So we need to work together to find solutions. And then still, I'm an optimist, and I asked some researchers recently, is there an option, or would it be possible that we all of a sudden get a fuel on the table that we have never seen before? And nobody has said, no, that's not possible. So I'm still very optimistic that so many clever brains are now looking into this. So right now, methanol, ammonia, and maybe we'll come up with a third or fourth fuel that we haven't seen before. And just, if I may, Charles, just also mention that when we're talking about these green fuels, that's very much related to the international shipping. But when we talk about the shipping sector, we should not forget the short sea shipping, which is high-speed travel. It's container passengers trading around all over the world. That's coastal shipping. And I think there we will also have electrical solutions. So there's also a question about, and I think this is where governments probably also have to look at their infrastructure, facilitate the options of having electrical infrastructure that actually makes it possible to have electrical driven short sea shipping, which I think it will be part of the equation also on the short sea shipping area. And we should not forget that there are many ships in that area as well.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's a really important point. It may not just be the fuels that we're talking about. It may be other forms of energy that can be used, particularly for shorter distance shipping. Hoon, can I just ask you to pick up there and just to sort of tell us a little bit more about the role of the Singapore government in trying to make the decisions around the future of the technologies that are needed and the fuels particularly?
So there are two aspects. The first is really we are preparing for a multi-fuel bunkering transition. It will be inevitable that there will be different ships of different profiles calling port, and we want to make sure that when these ships call on our port, you have the bunkering option. So biofuel, LNG, we've already started and done it. Ammonia, we are actually in a couple of projects working together with industry players, and that's the second part, what I call value chain ecosystem, where you get relevant players, energy companies, shipping companies, port authorities to come together along the whole value chain to be able to cater to a specific technology. In ammonia, we are in one or two of the projects now, one of which is Castor Initiative. We'll be announcing our involvement in a couple more ammonia fuel value chain ecosystem. The objective is to develop ammonia bunker tanker to have ammonia bunkering take place when the ammonia vessels are ready. What we've seen from the various projects we are in, perhaps 2025, 2027, this is the years which companies are planning for their trial on ammonia tankers, ammonia ships, and that's where bunkering has to be ready. So we are also developing what is the type of ammonia bunkering standards, trials, regulatory sandbox that we can put in place. Ammonia is, in a way, the carrier is inexistent, so the specification of the ships, etc., carriers are already there. It's the land ship-to-ship bunkering standards. Well, we 9 years ago, before LNG ships came into play, there is also a lot of uncertainty surrounding LNG ships. It took us with some port authorities to come up with LNG bunkering standards. It took us 9 years to bring it to ISO, to bring it to IMO. If we count backwards on 2050 and 2030, we don't have many years to expedite the timeline together with like-minded port like Andreas in Denmark, Rotterdam, etc., to really make sure the standards, at least on the trial basis, is in place as safe as it is possible. We'll take ourselves, Singapore, as a living lab. We will be able to try to facilitate such trials here.
That's really helpful. And I guess that you are collaborating with other ports closely to try and think about how this could be put in place. Andreas, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I just want to in following up on Lee Hoon's, I think also that, coming back to the question of what governments can do, I think also that the concept of green lanes, I think that's really an important thing there, where we can generate concrete partnerships and say that between these two ports or between these two regions, that there will be green transport. And I think that, I think it's very important that we also, when we are having these discussions and considerations, that we tend to also move into what will be the actual concrete action point. And I think this is, that governments can facilitate and make it attractive for operators to join into a concrete green transport lane, and where we can maybe facilitate that there will be, as Lee Hoon saying, green bunkering available in both ends. So I think that will be the way forward. Again, because we cannot, there's no silver bullet. So it's not like we go home on Friday and then Monday morning the whole world will be green. It has to be one step at a time. And I think that we need to move into that direction. And personally, I just want to bring the concept of green lane into play here. Yeah.
Hoon. Yeah.
If I just build on Andreas, the other key aspect is really sharing of information. So we shouldn't, the different players cannot see it as a competition. It is trying to solve a global solution. And therefore, having having the inclusive model is actually a very important approach that we have to take, including in IMO. How do we share the information with member states? How do we ensure that, for example, the facilities that we have, the trial and standards, we actually should open up such information so as many players can come on board. Similarly, I would say horizontal collaboration has to be there. I say horizontal because most of the time we talk a lot about vertical integration, but in this case, if the shipping companies don't share information with one another, of course you keep certain IP to yourself to have that competitive edge because you put in money for R&D, but how do you share some information, especially with port regulatory authorities? How do you share as much information as you can so that we can all come out with the basic infrastructure for bunkering to take place around the world? I think that's essential. So just wanted to emphasize the point on sharing and horizontal collaboration.
Hugely important point. I think going back to that point you were making, Andreas, as well about green shipping routes. Of course, the recent COP26 came up with a declaration around green shipping routes, which needs to be expanded. But Andreas, just briefly, and then we want to come on, if we can, to the market-based mechanisms.
I just want to really, just emphasize what Lee Hoon. I think it's an extremely important point Lee Hoon is raising here, and I think also again this is really a huge challenge for the shipping industry. Because we have seen it again and again, particularly when we're discussing energy efficiency, regulatory mechanisms, the sharing of data is extremely important, and we have to. There's really a barrier here that has to be broken because it's not the shipping companies. It's such price competitive industry, and they're very reluctant in sharing their actual data. But I think Lee Hoon is pointing to something of extreme importance that we need to really promote sharing of data, openness of results. Also, because we need to help each other getting wiser, but it's also by showcasing what you have done, and it can be done, that will also pave the way for those who have reluctance in getting into the game, because they can see, okay, it can actually be done in this way. Yeah.
Can I just come on to what you were talking about earlier, and in fact, all of you were talking about it, but certainly you raised it, Jeremy, right at the beginning, this question of what are the appropriate market-based mechanisms to bring to play here. I mean, of course, we've got to drive the transition that needs to be made for fuels, but in a broader context, for the broader decarbonisation of shipping, under your sense, as I understand it, you've plumbed for the carbon levy rather than a sort of a cap and trade approach. Why do you think the carbon levy is appropriate for shipping, particularly? How would such a system be implemented as well, and what are the advantages as you see it?
Yeah, I think it's. I think that the thing I think we're all agreed on is we need to have market-based measures of some sort, because if we just take the example of today. If you say fuel oil is about $650 a tonne, these new fuels are probably going to be around about $2,000 a tonne in the initial period. And then when we get scale and production, we may be able to get them down to around, say, $1,500 a tonne. So we need to have something that in place that is going to ensure that the first movers who are investing in these type of ships and who are going to be buying these type of expensive fuels are not going to be put at a huge disadvantage compared with the existing asset providers using the old fuel carbon ships. So how you do that? I mean, there's various debates and discussions. Do you have a trading scheme on a capping system where we buy credits from the market, or do we have a scheme where we simply put a levy on the bunker fuel, and if you still want to use bunker fuel, you can. But guess what? It's just going to be a lot more expensive to use in the future. And that would then sort of start to balance up against the price of the new fuels, which, of course, are much, much lower emissions. So we personally, as Social Network Express, we like the bunker levy thing. We think it's relatively straightforward. And we would very much encourage governments and the IMO to take this forward, because at the end of the day, we need something that is going to be universal, predictable, i.e. everybody's going to go and use the same mechanism, and something that we can pass on through the supply chain in terms of cost, and that we can explain to the end customer. And we had a very good example in 2020 when we brought in the low sulfur fuel. And the low sulfur fuel was just a lot more expensive than the old high sulfur fuel. And that mechanism allowed us to, show to the customer that the fuel is more expensive, to adjust our bunker formulas, and then to pass that through the supply chain. And that's worked really, really well. So we would like to see something similar, where the IMO brings it in, it's universal, it's paid at the point of bunkering, it's on the bunkering invoice, it's totally transparent, the money's collected and goes back to the IMO to be used in however appropriate way it should be. Meantime, we can then ensure that the high carb fuel provider users will pay a higher price than the new innovative low carb fuel users. So we think it's a lot more simple. It's easy to pass on from the ship owner to the charterer through to the shipper and the final freight payer, and for them to pass through, and it's totally transparent.
Andreas, is that a solution you see as being viable? Is it something you think the IMO, is the IMO working on that now? I assume it is. And how easy is it to implement a system like that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. But I just want to say, good ideas have a tendency to return. And 12 years ago, Denmark actually championed a proposal on a market-based measure, which was actually a levy. Time was not ripe at that point. I think we are at a completely different place today. And I have no doubt that we need to discuss at some point a market-based measure. What kind of measure? I'm not sort of in a fixed position at this point. I think we need to address all issues. There's no doubt, as Jeremy just excellently lined out, the levy is very easy to understand. It's very transparent, and you can set a price that it immediately eliminates the price difference between green fuel and fossil fuel. But having said that, it sounds easy, but just the fact that it will probably generate the biggest tank of money ever generated on Earth will sort of raise a lot of issues on governance, what should the money be spent for, and that kind of things. And then we also need to see if it will it have the effect we want. So this has to be compared with an emission trading scheme. So I think that in the end, we need to have a market-based measure, but what kind of measure and how we're going to set it up, I think that will remain to be seen. I just have to say that if we're talking about a levy, I think that we also need to be realistic and saying that that's going to take several years to establish, again, because we're talking about such an astronomical amount of money that we need to it's probably going to have, and I'm just saying this from my personal assessment, probably going to have its own convention, and because it will really be a very serious regulating instrument, and again, collecting so much money that we have to be sure on a global scale on how we're going to do that. But the short of the matter is that, yes, we need a market-based measure in order to assist, especially the first movers, to eliminate the price differences. I see no other way, that we have to have some kind of mechanism that assists in the right direction. Yeah.
Hoon, I'm sure you're not going to disagree with that, but what's your thoughts around the market-based mechanism?
So, totally agree. We need market-based mechanism to reduce the price differential and catalyze the uptake of low and zero carbon emission solutions. And I do agree with Jeremy in a way that a global carbon levy on marine fuel consumption is actually very straightforward, it's easy to implement. And actually, coming from an open economy, you seldom hear companies themselves wanting to impose a levy on themselves. So this is one shipping sector for the past year who's been lobbying to have a levy imposed on me, because they want to establish an International Maritime Research and Development Board to help spur the technological development. But it will take time. I think it will take time. Discussions in IMO on a global at a global level, it takes time. The question then, therefore, is in the transition and in the intermediate term, what can be ways to help finance some of the research, the trials, as well as even the smaller companies to try to adopt. And that goes into the question of green financing. Are there green loans that we can work together with like-minded partners, whether it's banks or institutions or even, I would say, containers earning great profits during this period to come together to offer that help and support. The other way would be to start accounting, for example, for companies who have started doing all these research and trials, to start accounting for the credits that they have and perhaps exchange credits for financing with other sectors first. And the funds can therefore be reinvested into spurring technological breakthrough. In Singapore, when we set up the GCMD, we were very heartened that when MPA put in 60 million, and we've got 6 players who come in straight away to put in another 60 million, and we've got 120 million to help spur trials going ahead for the future of ships. So in a way, I would say that we need, the longer term, Singapore supports having a global carbon levy on marine fuel consumption. But between now and then, before the whole setup is being approved and being set up with a lot of other technicalities that you need to discuss, what is the way to bring green financing as much as possible to spur technological advancement? And that you probably need a whole myriad of different measures, whether it's green financing, lower interest rate loans, or whether it's a carbon-based mechanism, market-based mechanisms, carbon credit. So I think we probably need to use a whole range of measures. The key is we need the solution.
I absolutely agree. That's a whole other discussion, the green financing, the innovation around potentially stepping into the gap there, whilst the IMO and others, countries, member countries, make decisions about what kind of trading mechanisms might work and what would be appropriate, or rather carbon pricing mechanisms, should I say. Can I just come back then to that very last question? We're almost out of time, but just to get your own thoughts, your own sense of optimism or pessimism around this. I mean, 2023 is going to be an important year at the IMO. One factor in this, but not the only factor, as we've heard today, is this need to set a target for 2050 to give some level of certainty to the entire industry, and to all of those that are supplying and part of the industry. Is the IMO, in your view, ready to really bite the bullet and say 2050 is going to be the target for net zero? Jeremy, let's just a brief answer from all of you as we're almost out of time. But Jeremy, your thoughts: optimistic or pessimistic?
I think we're doing all we can. I think we've got two fantastic governments. Singapore and Denmark have always been. We as the industry operators are right into the IMO with our green strategy and trying to encourage them. We have to. It's our only chance, Charles. If we don't get the IMO the way of doing it, so we have to be optimistic. We have to keep pushing. We have to win this.
Andreas, your thoughts, finally.
I think the IMO, and we should remember IMO means the member states, and I think definitely that a vast majority of member states will be ready in 2023 when the time comes. I'm quite confident and optimistic in that sense. Yeah.
Hoon, the last
There's
word.
already a target of reduction of at least 50%. So now it's a matter of negotiations and discussion to cut another 50%. So I'm sure the momentum is there. There's discussion, and like what Andreas said, is 100 plus members. So I can expect quite intensive discussion and some difference in view between different member states.
Well, as you said, Jeremy, it has to happen somehow. If we have to get over that line. Let me thank you all for, I thought, a very fascinating discussion. Jeremy Nixon, Chief Executive of Ocean Network Express, Andreas Nordseth, who's the Director General of the Danish Maritime Authority, and of course, Quah, who's the Chief Executive of the Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore. Thank you all.